Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for tuning in. Guys, Sean Combs aka Puff Daddy has been hit with another lawsuit, making it lawsuit number 8. I want to go through the facts of the lawsuit and leave you guys to your own thoughts. So let's jump right into it. Upon information and belief, Ms. Lampros met Mr. Combs in early 1994 after the birth of his first son, Justin Dior Combs. At the time, Ms. Lampros was a college student at the Fashion Institute of Technology, studying fashion design and marketing. To impress her, Mr. Combs will often invite her to Bad Boy recording studios in New York City. When she met Mr. Combs, Ms. Lampros shared with him her dreams of working in the fashion industry, and Mr. Combs promised to mentor her and help her by introducing her to music and fashion industry executives, as well as assisting her with finding work. Mr. Combs love bombed her. He showered her with gifts and flowers, as evidenced by one of the cards that accompanied the flowers that Mr. Combs sent Miss Lampros for Valentine's Day in 1994. Mr. Combs went so far as to invite Miss Lampros to his first Father's Day celebration. The invitation to that event is below. The invitation reads as follows: Dear friends, on June 19th, 1994, Bad Boy Entertainment would like for you to come and join us in celebrating the original Bad Boy's first Father's Day celebration. For this occasion, there is a dress code. No jeans or sneakers will be permitted. The spectacular event will be held at the Capitol, located at 1110 First Avenue at 61st Street. The event will begin promptly at 10 p.m. and will go on until. Please come early to avoid any inconvenience. For further information, you can contact the Bad Boy offices. Remember, the dress code will be strictly enforced, so dress your best. Thanks for your support. Sincerely, Bad Boy Entertainment. A month after the Father's Day event, Mr. Combs invited Miss Lampros to an exclusive Bad Boy party with performances by Usher, Craig Mack, and the Notorious B.I.G. Upon information and belief, what Mr. Combs displayed as kind gestures quickly manifested into an aggressive, coercive, and abusive relationship based on sex. These acts were not isolated to the state of New York, as Mr. Combs would fly Miss Lampros to Atlanta to see him, where they would spend time together. Miss Lampros would also fly to Miami to see Mr. Combs at his home. Upon information and belief, throughout the years with Mr. Combs, there were 4 terrifying sexual encounters Miss Lampros endured. According to Miss Lampros, Mr. Combs had a terrible temper and often threatened to harm her if she failed to do what he said, if he witnessed her talking to other men, or if she failed to take his phone calls. According to Miss Lampros, she was not allowed to talk about her relationship with Mr. Combs to anyone because he did not want anyone to know he was seeing her because she is a white woman. Sexual assault encounter 1. The first horrific sexual encounter occurred in 1995 when Miss Lampros met up with Mr. Combs in south of Houston, Soho, at a bar. She was introduced to a woman named Redacted, and the group lightly drank throughout the evening. At the time, Miss Lampros was a college student and did not drink any alcohol. Due to Mr. Combs' delusional and violent outbursts, she succumbed to pressure and reluctantly drank with Mr. Combs and the redacted individual. As they drank, Miss Lampros began to feel uneasy. At the point, she only had a few sips of one drink. Miss Lampros and Redacted were guided to a vehicle and left the bar with Mr. Combs. They arrived at the Millennium Hotel. While at the hotel, Miss Lampros continued to feel uneasy. She recalls feeling like the walls were closing in on her. She was laid on the hotel bed, where Mr. Combs forced himself on top of her. Mr. Combs began to kiss Miss Lampros as she turned her head, trying to avoid the interaction. He grabbed her face. Mr. Combs continued to forcefully kiss her. Miss Lampros informed him that she wasn't feeling well, but he ignored her words and continued to take off her clothing. Miss Lampros tried to hold on to her clothing, but she felt weak and powerless in the situation. She pleaded with Mr. Combs to stop, and he ignored her. She could not process why this was occurring and felt a loss of control. She said that she was raped by Mr. Combs, and she soon passed out. The next morning, Miss Lampros was awoken by the sun peering through the drapes. She was nude, sore, and confused. Miss Lampros quickly got out of bed, clothed herself, and left the hotel room as fast as she could. Months after the first grape, Mr. Combs pursued Miss Lampros. He sent her gifts, cards, and flowers, and used his power and access to music industry events to lure Miss Lampros back to him. Miss Lampros was a hopeful yet naive college student and took Mr. Combs at his word and believed that the first grape was a possible mulligan and decided to give him a second chance. At the time, Miss Lampros was a college student in her late teens and early 20s. Her decision to return to Mr. Combs after being great was indicative of many assault survivors who returned to their abusers. She agreed to meet Mr. Combs to discuss the business opportunities he promised, as he knew her passion was to pursue a career in fashion and music. They met up and talked near his Manhattan apartment, which was somewhere near 30th Street at the time. Miss Lampros was under the impression that what had occurred months prior between them would not happen again. She was holding on to Mr. Combs' promises of access to his industry and to pursue her passion. Mr. Combs was respectful, regained her trust, and used their common interactions with Arista Records. Things seemed to be normal between the two until the second incident of sexual assault. Encounter number 2. During a second incident of sexual assault, Mr. Combs and Miss Lampros were in a parking garage near his Manhattan apartment. She believes it was somewhere near 30th Street. They were headed to dinner and Mr. Combs was slightly inebriated. As they headed toward the parking garage, Mr. Combs grasped Miss Lampros by the waist and forced her down on her knees. He quickly unzipped his pants, exposing his erect. He grabbed her hair, wrapping it around his fist. He then forced his erect into her mouth and demanded Miss Lampros perform. As Miss Lampros' eyes filled with tears, she can see the parking garage attendant witnessing this horrific assault. This had no impact on Mr. Combs. He was blinded by his lustful desire to pleasure himself at Mrs. Lampros' expense. When Mr. Combs was done with her, he told her to get up. She was in shock, morally depleted, embarrassed, and in physical agony because Mr. Combs violently yanking her down on her knees and pulling her hair. Once again, she made the decision to distance herself, and once again, Mr. Combs came back with gifts and empty promises. Miss Lampros was not moved. She had enough and decided to focus on her studies and leave Mr. Combs for good. Unbeknownst to Miss Lampros, Mr. Combs was not good at accepting rejection. He immediately switched his approach to become angry, threatening, and forceful. He developed a monster persona, and Mrs. Lampros was in fear of him. Mr. Combs calling her incessantly and would often call her just to say, "If anyone is in your apartment, I will beat your ass and theirs." Miss Lampros reasonably feared Mrs. Lampros's I can't say it right. Miss Lampros's reasonable fear of Mr. Combs left her feeling stuck with him and with no way out. He knew where she lived and worked and had connections to ensure her compliance with his demands. She felt if she disobeyed him, he would take away her dreams of pursuing a career in his world. Mr. Combs would also threaten to blacklist her in the industry if she tried to mess with him in any way. Miss Lampros's dreams and everything she's been working hard for were in the palm of his hands. Encounter number 3. One night in 1996, Mr. Combs ordered Miss Lampros to his Manhattan apartment. Mr. Combs' residence was in the 30s and parked near the Midtown Tunnel. When Miss Lampros arrived, Kim Porter and 2 other people were present. Mr. Combs introduced the women. They went into a nightclub. After the club closed, they returned to Mr. Combs' apartment and they began a night of drinking. After a couple of hours into the evening, Mr. Combs forced Miss Porter and Miss Lampros to take ecstasy. Mr. Combs instructed the women to open their mouths. When they complied with the demand, Mr. Combs forced a pill down their throats to ensure the pill was swallowed. Mr. Combs' hands were so far down Miss Lampros's throat she gagged. He even checked under their tongues. With the combination of alcohol and ecstasy, Miss Lampros recalls feeling lightheaded and lethargic. After being forced to take ecstasy, Mr. Combs then demanded Kim to have sexual intercourse with Miss Lampros. Miss Lampros vocally opposed this idea, but Mr. Combs quickly reminded her that she had no control over the situation as he could make her lose her job. Miss Lampros knew that she had to comply because she had witnessed what happens when somebody defies Mr. Combs. She had also been threatened and victimized by Mr. Combs and did not want to cause a problem because she feared him. As Mr. Combs demanded Miss Porter and Miss Lampros to engage in sex, Mr. Combs sat close by, masturbated for some time before pushing Kim Porter off Miss Lampros and forcing his inside of her and raping her. Miss Lampros felt numb at the moment and emotionally checked out. A few hours later, Miss Lampros recalls being woken up by Mr. Combs and told to leave the residence. She felt disgusted, ashamed, and embarrassed and couldn't believe what had happened. Shortly after this event, she slowly distanced herself from Mr. Combs. Even though she was reluctant to be with him, he used industry connections and invitations to exclusive events to keep her attached. Mr. Combs went so far as to invite her to Kim Porter's birthday celebration. End of the road. In or about 1998, Miss Lampros found the courage to end her relationship with Mr. Combs. She had finally suffered enough. However, this ending was one-sided. Mr. Combs and Kim Porter weren't done with Miss Lampros. Kim Porter was very resentful of Miss Lampros after she was forced to engage in sex act with Miss Lampros. She dined at Miss Lampros's place of employment, a bar named Silver, which was in Soho. According to Miss Lampros, Miss Porter was enraged when she saw her. According to Miss Lampros, 2 days later, Miss Porter called her employer and complained to the manager, alleging that Miss Lampros attempted to poison her. She then stated that her boyfriend was Sean Combs and could have the business shut down if he did not immediately terminate Miss Lampros. Later that evening, the manager told her he had to let her go because Mr. Combs called and demanded that he fire her. Miss Lampros believes that Miss Porter got Miss Lampros fired in retaliation for what Mr. Combs made them do. According to Mrs. Lampros, her boss was afraid of Mr. Combs and his contacts and told her he had to do it or Mr. Combs could risk getting his business closed. Miss Lampros called Mr. Combs and he showed no remorse that she was out of a job. In fact, he laughed about it. At the end of their relationship, Miss Lampros called Mr. Combs's being adolescent in both length and width. She recalls him being circumcised and remembers a tattoo on his chest. Oh, Lord. Sean John Clothing. While in a relationship with Mr. Combs, Miss Lampros was a student at FIT. She had a passion for fashion and knew Mr. Combs knew this. Mr. Combs promised Miss Lampros several working opportunities in the fashion and music industry, and the two often discussed his plans to launch his own clothing brand. Within months of Miss Lampros ending their relationship, Mr. Combs launched Sean John. Encounter number 4. According to Miss Lampros, she saw Mr. Combs at an event at Rockefeller Center in or about the end of 2000 toward the beginning of 2001. At the time, Miss Lampros says Mr. Combs may have been filming a season of Making the Band. According to Miss Lampros, when Mr. Combs saw her, he approached her and asked the camera crew to turn off the cameras to not film their interaction. According to Miss Lampros, Mr. Combs asked her how she was, expressed to her that he missed her, and asked if she would leave the event at Rockefeller Center with him. Miss Lampros rejected Mr. Combs and left. According to Miss Lampros, later that evening he kept calling her and asking if she would come to his apartment on Park Avenue, but she said no. He even offered to send his driver to pick her up. Finally, he offered to come with the driver to pick her up. According to Miss Lampros, Mr. Combs did not like the word no. He called a few more times, so she stopped answering the phone. According to Miss Lampros, a few days later, he called again, begging to see her. Reluctantly and regrettably, she allowed him to come over to her apartment, located at 477 Central Park West, to hear what he had to say. Miss Lampros figured it was during the day and doubted that he would try to harm her. According to Miss Lampros, when she opened the door, his security was sitting on the stairwell. Knowing that security was there made Miss Lampros feel a little better about letting him in. They sat on her couch and began talking. According to Ms. Lampros, Mr. Combs began apologizing for his past behaviors. He started telling her that he was a changed man. He then showered her with compliments, telling her how good she looked, and kept reminiscing about their prior sex life. He then began dropping hints about them having sex. Miss Lampros rejected his advances. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Mr. Combs violently grabbed her and forced himself on top of her. He began kissing her and touching her against her will. At that point, Miss Lampros fought him off after she quickly realized it was a big mistake to have allowed him to visit her. She told him to leave as she felt that he just wanted to use her for sex and hadn't changed at all. Even more disgusting was the fact that Miss Lampros knew that Mr. Combs was involved in a very public relationship with Jennifer Lopez. According to several media reports from that time, Mr. Combs ended his relationship with J-Lo due to infidelity in February 2001. This was around the same time that Mr. Combs sexually assaulted Miss Lampros. Luckily for Miss Lampros, the couch was right near the door of the apartment, so it was easy for her to reach for the door, open it, and demand him to leave. She ensured that his security could hear her telling him to exit. She was afraid that Mr. Combs would have raped her, as he does not like to take no for an answer, and had a history of violently handling her and forcing her to perform oral on him. Miss Lampros is in possession of several of Mr. Combs' phone numbers throughout the years. According to Miss Lampros, in or about 2023, she was at a function and a gentleman whose name is redacted informed the man Miss Lampros was dating that he should reconsider dating her because he personally saw a video of her and Sean Combs having sex. According to Miss Lampros, the individual who is redacted shared that he saw the tape during the summer of 1997. According to Miss Lampros, she was told that Mr. Combs apparently recorded them having sex without her knowing and showed it to multiple people. All right, so now we're going to go into the cause of action. Battery. Ms. Lampros incorporates by reference all preceding paragraphs and realleges them as set forth herein. The defendant committed battery against Ms. Lampros when he penetrated Ms. Lampros orally and vaginally against her will, as detailed in the 4 encounters above. In addition, Miss Combs physically, I think that's supposed to say Mr. Combs, physically assaulted Ms. Lampros when he pulled her hair and forced her to perform oral sex on him in an open parking garage with the parking attendant watching. Defendant Combs intentionally and without her consent attached Ms. Lampros to satisfy his sexual desires. Under all circumstances, the defendant's physical contact with Ms. Lampros was offensive and wrongful. Defendant Combs continued to attack Ms. Lampros despite her attempts to thwart his actions. The defendant's conduct was the direct and proximate cause of Ms. Lampros' past and future substantial damages, including significant pain and suffering, lasting psychological and financial harm, loss of dignity, and invasion of privacy. The defendant's actions constitute sexual offenses as defined in Article 130 of the New York Penal Law, including but not limited to sexual misconduct and forcible touching. The plaintiff's claim for battery is thus timely under the Gender Motivated Violence Act, NYC Admin Code. Second cause of action, assault, sexual assault. Ms. Lampros incorporates by referencing all preceding paragraphs and realleges them as set forth herein. As described above, defendant Combs frightened and placed plaintiff in an apprehension of harm when he physically assaulted her within the city of New York. Defendant forcibly touched and attempted and or threatened to touch plaintiff's intimate areas and or touch with his intimate body parts. As a result of defendant Combs' conduct, plaintiff has suffered and continues to suffer harm, including physical injury, severe emotional distress, humiliation, anxiety, and other consequential damages for which she is entitled to an award of monetary damages or other relief. The conduct of defendant Combs described above was willful and malicious. At all relevant times, defendant acted with conscious disregard for plaintiff's rights and feelings, acted with the knowledge of or with reckless disregard for the fact that his conduct was certain to cause injury and or humiliation to plaintiff and intended to cause fear, physical injury, and or pain and suffering to plaintiff. By virtue of the foregoing, plaintiff is entitled to recover punitive damages. Third cause of action, negligent infliction of emotional distress. Ms. Lampros incorporates by referencing all preceding paragraphs and realleges them as set forth herein. The defendant's conduct created an unreasonable risk of causing emotional distress to plaintiff, and the defendants knew or should have known that such conduct was likely to result in emotional distress that might and or likely would cause illness or bodily harm. The plaintiff's emotional distress was foreseeable to the defendant. As a direct and proximate result of the negligent conduct of the defendants, plaintiffs suffer and will continue to suffer severe emotional distress. Plaintiff's conduct was malicious, willful, and or cruel, entitling plaintiff to punitive damages. All right, fourth cause of action, violation of the Victims of Gender Motivated Violence Protection Law. The above described conduct of defendant Combs, including but not limited to Combs' sexual assault of plaintiff in New York City, constitutes a crime of violence against plaintiff and is a crime of violence motivated by gender. As detailed above, Ms. Lampros worked for Arista Records during Mr. Combs' assault. Bad Boy Records was a subsidiary of Arista Records. At the time, Ms. Lampros reported to her manager Jeff, who was an agent of Arista Records. Defendants AR and SME enabled Mr. Combs' commission of the crimes of gender violence motivated by gender and thus are liable under NYC Victims of Gender Motivated Protection Act. Defendants AR and SME enabled or participated in the sexual abuse of plaintiff because defendants failed to, among other things, protect plaintiff from known danger, have sufficient policies and procedures in place to prevent sexual assault, properly implement policies and procedures to prevent sexual assault, take reasonable measures to ensure that policies to prevent sexual assault were working, train their employees on identifying sexual assault and inappropriate workplace behaviors, protect their employees from sexual assault, and adhere to applicable standard of care. Defendants Arista Records enabled or participated in the sexual abuse of plaintiff because defendants failed to timely and properly educate, train, supervise, and or monitor their agents or employees regarding policies and procedures that should be followed when sexual abuse is suspected or observed. Prior to Combs' sexual assault, plaintiff Arista Records knew or should have known that Combs was not fit to be in a position of authority. Defendants by and through their agents, servants, and or employees become aware or should have become aware of Combs' propensity to commit sexual assault and of the risk to plaintiff's safety. At the very least, defendants knew or should have known that they did not have sufficient information about whether or not their leaders, managers, and people were safe to be in positions of power. Defendant Arista Records knew or should have known that Combs posed a risk of sexual assault. Defendant Arista failed to properly supervise Combs and protect plaintiff from a known danger, thereby enabling Combs' repeated sexual assaults on plaintiff. Defendant Arista Records negligently deemed Mr. Combs was fit to be in a position of authority and or that any previous suitability problems Mr. Combs had were fixed and cured, and or that Mr. Combs would not commit acts of sexual assault and or that Mr. Combs would not injure others. Moreover, defendant Arista Records enabled the sexual abuse of plaintiffs by actively maintaining and employing Mr. Combs in a position of power and authority through which Mr. Combs had control over people, including plaintiff. As a direct and proximate result of the aforementioned crime of violence and gender-motivated violence, plaintiff has sustained and will continue to sustain monetary damages, physical injury, pain and suffering, and serious psychological and emotional distress, entitling her to an award of compensatory and punitive damages, injunctive and declaratory relief, attorney's fees and costs, and other remedies as this court may deem appropriate, set forth in, and there's the statute. The above described conduct of defendants constitutes a sexual offense as described in Article 130 of the New York Penal Code. Pursuant to this particular statute, this cause of action is timely because it is commenced within 2 years and 6 months after September 1st, 2022. So now we have the prayer for relief. Wherefore, plaintiff prays that the court enter judgment in her favor against defendants containing the following relief: for money judgment representing compensatory damages, including consequential damages, lost wages, earnings, and all other sums of money, together with interest on these amounts according to proof. For money judgment for mental pain and anguish and severe emotional distress according to proof. For punitive and exemplary damages according to proof. For attorney fees and costs. For prejudgment and post-judgment interest, and such other and further relief as the court may deem just and proper. Okay, so there you have it, guys. This is lawsuit number 8. I'm not going to give my opinion right now, but you guys are free to formulate your own opinion, and I will catch y'all on the next one. Peace.